On May 25, 2025, a freight train quietly left western China. No fanfare, no press conference, no breaking news alert, 32 containers, 10,400 kilometers, 4 countries, 15 days, and when that train finally stopped, it was sitting in Iran. Now, here is what nobody is telling you about that moment. This was not just a train delivering cargo. This was the moment that America's most powerful weapon, the one that took decades to build, had a hole punched straight through it. And the most dangerous part? Most people in the West have absolutely no idea it even happened. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why this single train journey changes the rules of global power, what China is actually building across Central Asia and the Arctic, and why the next decade of geopolitics will be shaped by what started in a desert with 32 containers. Stay until the end, because the 5-nation expansion plan that comes after this railway is the part that should genuinely concern you. Let's get into it. For the last 40 years, the United States did not need to fire a single missile to destroy a country's economy. It had a far more elegant weapon: economic strangulation, block a country's oil sales, freeze its bank accounts, cut it off from international financial systems, warn every company on Earth that if they dare do business with the target, they lose access to American markets. Do all of that at the same time and you do not need an army. The country slowly runs out of options, runs out of money, runs out of time. This strategy worked, and it worked really well, because of one simple geographic truth: America controls the ocean. And if you want to move anything at scale, oil, food, industrial equipment, consumer goods, you use ships. Ships use oceans, and oceans are where American naval power lives. The United States operates 11 aircraft carrier strike groups. No other country on Earth operates more than 2. Those carrier groups can project force into almost any stretch of open water within days. So when Washington decided to economically isolate a country like Iran, the ocean became the enforcement mechanism. You do not need to physically stop every ship. You just need the threat to be real enough that shipping companies, insurers, and banks police themselves. And they do. Every single time. Iran has lived under this system for decades. Every time it tried to break free, find new buyers, new routes, new banking channels, the pressure intensified. European companies pulled out. Asian companies got warned. Banks got fined billions of dollars. The economic fence around Iran got tighter every year, until a freight train proved the fence had a massive gap in it. But before we talk about China's solution, you need to understand what China itself was actually afraid of. There is a stretch of water between Malaysia and Indonesia that most people couldn't find on a map if you paid them. It is called the Strait of Malacca. It is roughly 800 kilometers long, and at its narrowest point, just 2.8 kilometers wide, and it is quietly one of the most important pieces of geography on this entire planet. Over 94,000 ships pass through the Strait of Malacca every single year. Oil tankers, container ships, cargo vessels, all funneling through this one narrow corridor to move between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. For China, this is not just important, it is existential. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports pass through this single passage, 80%, through one narrow strip of water. Think about what that exposure actually means in practice. If the Strait of Malacca closed for just 1 week, China could lose up to $64 billion in economic activity. A closure lasting longer would start shutting down factories across the country, cutting fuel supplies, spiking prices for over 1 billion people. The world's second largest economy, running on a single thread. And here's the part that kept Chinese military planners awake at night. Since 2019, the United States has had the right to dock its warships and aircraft carriers at Singapore's deep-water naval bases. Singapore sits right at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca. In a serious conflict between the US and China, Washington could effectively close that passage within 24 hours. One decision, one order, and China's energy supply switches off like a light. Chinese strategists actually have a name for this problem. They call it the Malacca Dilemma, and it has no maritime solution. The backup routes add thousands of kilometers to any journey and simply cannot handle the volume. Rerouting even a fraction of China's oil through those alternatives would take years and billions of dollars. China needed a route that no navy could threaten, no sanctions could reach, no blockade could touch. The answer was, to stop using the ocean entirely. Now building a railway from China to Iran sounds almost straightforward on paper. Actually doing it is something else. The route crosses some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. Vast open deserts where sandstorms swallow equipment overnight. Mountain ranges sitting in earthquake-prone zones, where the ground can literally shift beneath the track. Temperature swings that crack concrete and warp metal. And that is just the geography. The railway also passes through 4 different countries, each with its own borders, its own customs systems, its own bureaucratic rules, and critically, its own railway gauge. The width of the tracks is different in each country, which means a train cannot simply roll from one nation's tracks into another's without some kind of intervention. The track starts in western China, it heads west across Kazakhstan, down through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, then finally crosses into Iran and arrives at a dry port near Tehran. 10,400 kilometers of connected track. To give you a sense of that distance, it is roughly the same as flying from London to Los Angeles and still having hundreds of kilometers left to go. The total project cost exceeded $2 billion, funded through Chinese policy banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and a web of bilateral loan agreements across multiple governments. But the single biggest engineering headache was not the desert or the mountains, it was the gauge mismatch. Russia and Central Asia use a broader rail gauge than China. That means cargo either has to be physically transferred to different carriages at every border, which honestly, takes hours. Or, you install specialized systems that swap out the wheel assemblies automatically at the crossing point. China built automated bogie exchange stations at the key border crossings specifically for this route. What used to take hours now takes under 30 minutes. And then there is the security engineering that most people never talk about. Because parts of the terrain in Iran were considered vulnerable to airstrikes, key stretches of the railway were built underground, not to handle weather, not for engineering convenience. To survive a military attack. That single decision tells you everything you need to know about how seriously both countries approached this project. This was not infrastructure built for normal times, it was built to function during a crisis. On May 25, 2025, the first full freight service completed the journey in 15 days. Before this railway existed, the same cargo moved by ship, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Arabian Sea, and around the Persian Gulf. That sea journey took between 30 and 40 days. So yeah, that's 15 days versus 40 days. The railway cut it in half, with no oceans, no Western-controlled ports, and no naval patrols anywhere in between. China's state media called this route the oil lifeline between the two nations, but what this means for Iran goes far deeper than a faster shipping schedule. For Iran, this new railway offers a way to move goods and resources, even under the weight of international sanctions. It opens up new possibilities, for trade and economic resilience, allowing the country to bypass traditional routes that were vulnerable to outside pressure. In a world where access can be restricted by politics, this connection could honestly change the game for Iran's economy and its relationships abroad. Western sanctions have been grinding down Iran's economy for decades. Banks were cut off from global financial networks. International companies that tried to do business with Tehran faced massive penalties from Washington. Oil buyers across Asia and Europe were warned, quietly but clearly, that trading with Iran meant losing access to American markets. The strategy was total, it was methodical, and for a long time it worked. Then China made a different calculation. In 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year economic cooperation agreement worth $400 billion. Read that again, $400 billion, over 25 years. This is not a routine trade deal. This is a generational commitment, covering energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, and technology transfer. It says in diplomatic language, we are not going anywhere. By 2024, China was buying 77% of all of Iran's crude oil exports. That single trade relationship was worth roughly $29 billion in just 1 year. Iran's total oil revenues in 2024 reached $67 billion. a level the country had not seen in more than a decade. The sanctions were technically still on the books. Their real-world impact was collapsing. And now with the railway running, those oil shipments do not pass through a single route that Western authorities can monitor or disrupt. Iran loads oil onto trains. The trains roll east across Central Asian countryside. They arrive in China without a single Western bank involved anywhere in the transaction. That is not just trade. That is a completely parallel economic system operating entirely outside the architecture Washington spent 50 years constructing. And the currency dimension makes this even more structurally significant. China has been paying for Iranian oil in Chinese yuan since 2012. That sounds like a small technical detail. It is not. The dollar's position as the world's default currency for energy trade is one of the most important pillars of American global influence. Every time a major energy deal settles in yuan instead of dollars, that pillar takes another quiet hit. The gateway to the north is opening, and honestly, it is changing everything. As Arctic ice melts, new shipping lanes are emerging, reshaping global trade routes and, frankly, the balance of power. Countries bordering the Arctic are moving quickly to secure their interests, investing in ports, infrastructure, and military presence. The race for resources in this region, oil, gas, minerals, is intensifying, and, well, it is setting the stage for a whole new chapter in international competition. Russia has been doing the same thing since 2022, settling its energy exports in yuan and rubles, rather than dollars. The combined volume of trade now flowing outside dollar-denominated systems has grown sharply over the past 3 years. This railway adds another arterial bypass around the system. Here is the dimension of Iran's role that most people miss entirely. Iran is not just a buyer or a seller in this network. Iran is a gateway. The country sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. About 20% of all the world's oil passes through that strait. But beyond that, Iran shares borders with countries that are completely landlocked. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan. These nations have had no direct maritime access to global markets since they became independent after the Soviet collapse. Through Iran's ports and China's expanding rail network, those landlocked nations gain real economic connections for the first time in their modern history, and China gains something equally valuable: deeper political and economic influence across a region that has traditionally operated within Western spheres of interest. This is the logic behind the five-nation expansion plan, and it is already moving. Now, go in the completely opposite direction, north, far north, because at the same time, China is developing a route through the frozen Arctic. The Northern Sea Route runs along Russia's northern coastline through the Arctic Ocean. It is the most direct shipping path between Asia and Europe, cutting the journey from roughly 45 days via the Suez Canal down to around 30 days. The problem has always been ice. Until very recently, the Arctic route was only navigable for around 88 days per year. That window is growing. As global temperatures rise, Arctic ice is retreating earlier and returning later each year. In June 2024, Russia and China signed a formal agreement to build a year-round Arctic container shipping line. To handle the ice that remains, Russia has built the most powerful icebreakers ever constructed. The Arctica weighs 33,000 tons, runs on 2 nuclear reactors, can crush through ice 3 meters thick at a steady, continuous speed, and it can operate for 7 full years without refueling. Russia keeps building newer and more capable versions, each one pushing further into territory previously considered unreachable. In life, challenges are, just a part of the journey. Facing reality head-on takes courage, but it's through resilience that we truly grow. Sometimes, setbacks can feel overwhelming, but each obstacle is an opportunity to learn and adapt. By embracing both the highs and lows, we discover strengths we never knew we had. Remember, resilience isn't about avoiding difficulties, it's about bouncing back, stronger and wiser each time. So, as we move forward, let's keep in mind that every experience shapes us, and with a resilient spirit, We can handle whatever comes our way. Now, I want to be straight with you here, because this story deserves honesty, not hype. This railway cannot replace ocean shipping on its own, not even close. A single supertanker carries 2 million barrels of oil. That is the equivalent of hundreds of freight trains. Scaling rail to fully match maritime trade volumes is simply not possible in any near-term time frame. Multiple border crossings mean multiple customs checks and coordination delays. Desert heat and sandstorms degrade tracks faster than temperate climates. Fixed rail lines are easier to target than ships on open water, and the early results showed exactly these vulnerabilities. Just 19 days after the railway launched its first freight service, Israel conducted a large-scale attack targeting Iranian oil and gas infrastructure. No further public freight services on the corridor were reported after those strikes. But here is why that still misses the deeper point entirely. This railway does not need to replace sea routes to matter, it just needs to exist and work well enough to give both sides options they never had before. When China has a functioning land route for energy supply, even an imperfect one, the threat of a naval blockade at Malacca carries less weight. The leverage shrinks. The calculation changes on both sides. When Iran has a committed buyer operating outside Western financial systems, sanctions lose their grip, not instantly, not completely, but measurably and permanently. When landlocked Central Asian nations gain rail access to global markets, they gain the ability to choose their own partners, instead of accepting whoever shows up willing to invest. That changes the politics of an entire region. None of these shifts happen in a single dramatic moment. They happen steadily, quietly, one freight train at a time. There is something else going on here that pure economics cannot fully capture. Every kilometer of track that China lays in Central Asia sends a message to smaller countries watching from the sidelines. The message is simple. There is another option. You do not have to structure your trade, your debt, your infrastructure, or your foreign policy around the preferences of Washington or Brussels. There is a different set of partners, a different financial architecture, a different set of rules. That message, even without being stated directly, is one of the most consequential things this railway communicates to the world. What America is watching is not simply a railway being built across a desert. It is the slow but deliberate construction of an alternative to a system the West spent generations building and defending, a system built on naval dominance, dollar dependency, and control over the choke points of global trade. What China, Iran, Russia, and Central Asian nations are building together is a parallel answer to that system. So, here's the thing. It is incomplete. It faces real and serious obstacles. Parts of it have already been set back by military strikes. The Arctic route, still freezes for months of the year. The five-nation corridor is still partly on paper. But it is growing. And, honestly, it's operating in places where the old rules simply do not reach. Infrastructure is never just infrastructure. Every tunnel dug, every kilometer of track laid, every nuclear-powered icebreaker launched into Arctic water carries a message. And that message is this: the world does not have to work the way it always has. The world is changing. The countries watching from Washington understand exactly what that message means. And so do the countries building. So, here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Do you believe a land route across Central Asia and a frozen Arctic highway can ever seriously challenge the dominance of the world's oceans? Or is the sea still the king of global trade? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I read every single one. If this video shifted how you think about global power, hit the like button. It takes you 1 second and it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who would never find content like this otherwise. Subscribe if you are not already, because the next video goes even deeper into how China's strategy is quietly reshaping the politics of the entire global south, and you do not want to miss it. I will see you in the next one.